The ruling class. Elementi di Scienza Politica. Gaetano Mosca. Translation by Hannah D. Kahn. Edited and revised, with an introduction, by Arthur Livingston. 1896. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 7. Churches, Parties and Sects. 1. Buffon reports that if a certain number of stags are shut up in a park, they will inevitably divide into two herds which will always be in conflict with each other. An instinct of very much the same sort seems to make its influence felt among men. Human beings have a natural inclination toward struggle, but it is only sporadically that the struggle assumes an individual character, that one man is at war with another. Even when he fights, man remains preeminently a social animal. Ordinarily, therefore, we see men forming into groups, each group made up of leaders and followers. The individuals who make up a group are conscious of a special brotherhood and oneness with each other and vent their pugnacious instincts on members of other groups. This instinct of herding together and fighting with other herds is the prime basis and original foundation of the external conflicts that occur between different societies, but it also underlies the formation of all the divisions and subdivisions, all the factions, sects, parties and, in a certain sense, the churches, that arise within a given society and occasion moral and, sometimes, physical conflicts. In very small and primitive societies, where there is great moral and intellectual unity and individual members all have the same customs, the same beliefs, the same superstitions, the instinct mentioned may alone suffice to keep discordant and warlike habits alive. The Arabs and the Kabyles in Barbary share the same religious beliefs. They have the same degree and the same type of intellectual and moral culture. Yet, before the coming of the French, when they were not fighting against the infidels in Algeria and Tunis, against the Turks in Tripoli or against the Sultan in Morocco, they were fighting among themselves. Each confederation of tribes stood in rivalry or at open war with its neighbor confederation. There was discord within each confederation and often gunpowder was made to talk between sister tribes. Within the tribe the various douars were at swords' points, and often the douar was split by quarrels between the separate families. At other times, when social environments are very circumscribed, internal conflicts arise among minute sections of fairly civilized peoples. There may be no moral and intellectual differences between the enemy parties to justify such conflicts, or even if such differences exist they are used as mere pretexts. So the terms Guelph and Ghibelline supplied pretext and occasion, rather than cause, for intestine struggles in the medieval Italian communes, and the same may be said of the terms liberal, clerical, radical and socialist, which were bandied about by the factions that used to compete for administrative posts in the little towns of southern Italy. At moments of exceptional intellectual apathy, pretexts, even the most frivolous pretexts, may occasion serious conflicts within great and highly civilized societies. In Byzantium, during and after the reign of Justinian, the city streets were often stained with blood by struggles between two parties, the Greens and the Blues, the Persinians and the Venetians. Now those gangs originated in the circus, the spectators taking sides with the charioteers who raced under the two different colors. Eventually, to be sure, one faction or another at court would try to make use of the one or the other of the gangs. Now the Greens, now the Blues, enjoyed imperial favor, so that the parties came to acquire a certain political importance, without ever quite losing their status as personal sets, or gangs. Something remotely similar went on in a number of Italian cities before 1848, when men of the younger generation would form hostile cliques and factions about the merits of some prima donna or ballet girl. 2. In small societies as in large, when the hunger for conflict finds a vent in foreign rivalries and wars, it is to an extent appeased and so less readily seeks expression in civil discords or internal strife. On closely scrutinizing the nature of the political parties, the philosophical sects, the religious factions that everywhere develop within civilized societies, one sees that the pugnacious instinct of herding and fighting, which is the most primitive and, so to say, the most animal of the instincts, is mixed with other intellectual and psychological factors that are more complex and more human. In large, highly civilized societies, which are held together not only by moral and intellectual affinities but also by strong and complicated political organizations, a much greater speculative and effective freedom is possible than in small and loosely organized societies. In a great people, therefore, political and religious conflicts are further determined by the large number of currents of ideas, beliefs and attachments that succeed in asserting themselves, by the formation of different intellectual and moral crucibles within which the convictions and sentiments of single individuals are variously fused and alloyed. So we see Buddhism developing within Brahman society, Prophetism and, later on, the various schools of the Sadducees, the Essenes and the Zealots, keeping the life of Israel in ferment, Stoicism, Manichaeism, Christianity and the cult of Mithras competing for supremacy in the Helleno-Roman world, Mazdaism, a modification of Manichaeism with a marked tendency toward communism in wealth and women, sweeping through the Persia of the Sassanids, Mohammedanism starting in Arabia and spreading rapidly into Asia, Africa, and Europe. Phenomena altogether similar, though molded to the more rationalistic character of modern European civilization, are the liberalism and radicalism of the 19th century and, better yet, social democracy, which started almost contemporaneously with liberalism but has maintained its proselyting efficiency longer, so that it will continue to be one of the most significant historical factors in the 20th century as it was in the 19th. Besides the movements we have just named, it would be easy to trace a great many other minor currents in the history of civilized peoples, doctrines which have been more or less fortunate and have had more or less widespread vogues, but which in any event have helped to feed the instincts for contention, struggle, self-sacrifice and persecution that are so deeply rooted in the hearts of men. All these doctrines, all these currents of ideas, sentiments, convictions, seem to originate in somewhat the same way, and they all seem to present certain constant characteristics in their early beginnings. The human being, so feeble a creature in dealing with his own passions and the passions of others, often more selfish than need requires, as a rule vain, envious, petty, very rarely fails to keep two great aspirations before his eyes, two sentiments that ennoble, uplift and purify him. He seeks the truth, he loves justice, and sometimes he is able to sacrifice to those two ideals some part of the satisfaction he would otherwise give to his passions and his material interests. Far more complex and sensitive a being than the savage and the barbarian, civilized man may in some cases rise to a most delicate conception of these two sentiments. At certain moments in the history of a given society, an individual rises with the conviction that he has something new to say with regard to the search for truth, or a loftier doctrine to teach with regard to the better realization of justice. Such an individual, if he has certain endowments of character, and if environment and any number of other incidental circumstances favor, is the seed that may produce a tree with branches spreading far abroad over large parts of the world. 3. History has not always preserved all the details that we might wish to have about the lives of these founders of religious and politico-social schools. The latter are in a sense religions too, though shorn of strictly theological elements. Some biographies, however, are fairly well known. The lives of Muhammad, Luther, Calvin and especially Rousseau, who left his memoirs, can be analyzed with relative adequacy. A fundamental quality that all such people must have is, it would seem, a profound sense of their own importance or, better, a sincere belief in the efficacy of their work. If they believe in God, they will always consider themselves destined by the Omnipotent to reform religion and save humanity. Undoubtedly it is not to such men that one should look for a perfect balance of all the intellectual and moral faculties. But neither can they be considered altogether mad. Insanity is a disease that presupposes in the patient an earlier state of sanity. They are rather to be classed with so-called eccentrics, or fanatics, in the sense that they attach an exaggerated importance to certain phases of life, or of human activity, and stake their very lives and all the effort of which they are capable on one card, striving to attain their life's ideal by following unwanted paths which most people consider absurdly mistaken. But it is evident, on the other hand, that the man whose faculties are all in perfect balance, who has an exact perception of the results that he can achieve, as compared with the effort and sacrifice that will be required for achieving them, who takes a modest and sensible view of his own importance and of the real and abiding effects that his activity can have on the world in the ordinary course of human events, who calculates exactly and coldly the probabilities for and against his succeeding, will never launch out on any original and daring enterprise and will never do any very great things. If all men were normal and balanced, the history of the world would be very different and, we must confess, not a little monotonous. Indispensable in the leader of a party, in the founder of a sect or a religion, or, one might say, in any pastor of peoples who would make his own personality felt and force society to follow his views, is a capacity for instilling his own convictions and especially his own enthusiasms into others, a capacity for inducing many to live the sort of intellectual and moral life that he wants them to live and to make sacrifices for the ideals that he has conceived. Not all reformers have the gift of communicating their own sentiments and passions to others. Those who lack it may have great originality of thought and feeling, but they are ineffectual in practical life and often end as prophets without believers, innovators without followers, misunderstood and ridiculed geniuses. Those who do possess it not only inspire their apostles and the masses with their enthusiasms, sometimes to the point of frenzy, but succeed in the end in awakening a sort of veneration for their persons, in becoming objects of worship, so that their least act acquires its importance, their every word is believed without discussion, their every nod is blindly obeyed. About them an aura of exaltation gathers. It is highly contagious and spurs converts to acts of daring and sacrifice that certainly could not be performed by individuals in a normal state of mind. This explains the enormous success of certain preachers and certain teachers, the extraordinary fortune, for instance, of types so different as St. Francis of Assisi and Abelard, so unlike in many respects but so alike in the art of interesting men. It explains why Muhammad was held in such veneration by his initiates and disciples that they collected his spittle reverently and cherished the hairs of his beard as relics, and why a mere hint on his part was enough to encompass the murder of a dangerous adversary. Speaking of someone whom he considered to be a great obstacle to his designs, Muhammad would say, in the presence of some young man of the more fanatical type, "Will no one ever free me of this dog?" The disciple would rush off and commit the murder. Afterwards, naturally, Muhammad would condemn the crime, declaring that he had ordered no such thing. Any number of leaders of sects and political parties have imitated Muhammad, consciously or unconsciously, in this respect. And how many of them are doing the same thing today? Plenty of people were always ready to rush into the most hazardous undertakings at a nod from Mazzini. The various enterprises in practical communism that were launched in the course of the 19th century, from Owen down to Fourier and Lazzaretti, never failed to find large numbers of persons willing and eager to sacrifice their worldly goods. When one of these political or religious founders happens to be a fighter, as Jan Žižka was, he manages to inspire his followers with an absolute certainty of victory and hence with uncommon courage. Nor should we expect to find an altogether exquisite moral sense presiding uniformly over all acts in the lives of these eccentrics who initiate movements of ideas and sentiments. Any such expectation would be disappointed. Absorbed in the pursuit of their visions to the exclusion of everything else, they are always ready to suffer themselves and to make others suffer so long as their ends be attained. Generally, indeed, they feel a high disdain for everyday needs and for the material and immediate interests of life, or at least they are largely indifferent to them. Even when they do not say as much in words, they censure in their hearts people who are busy at sowing, reaping and storing away the harvests. They seem to feel certain that once the kingdom of God, or truth or justice, in their sense of those terms, is established, human beings will be as easily fed as are the fowl of the air or the lilies of the field. When they live in rationalistic and ostensibly more positive times, they take no account of the depletion of public resources that a mere gesture toward actuating their ideals would occasion. There seem to be three periods through which the life of every great reformer passes. In a first period he is conceiving his doctrine and working it out in his mind. During that stage he may be acting in good faith. He can be called a fanatic, but not as yet a cheat and a charlatan. In a second period he begins to preach, and then the need of making an impression induces him inevitably to lay on, to overstress certain colorings, and so to become a poseur. The third period comes if he is lucky enough to be able to make a practical attempt to put his teachings into practice. Once that stage is reached, he finds himself at grips with all the imperfections and weaknesses of human nature, and he is obliged to compromise on the side of morals if he wants to succeed. All reformers agree deep down in their hearts that the end justifies the means, that if men are to be led they have to be fooled to a certain extent. So, moving on from compromise to compromise, they come to a point where the most acute psychologists would find it hard to tell exactly where their sincerity ends and acting and chicanery begin. Father Ohrwalder was for some years a prisoner of the Mahdists and wrote an account of his experiences. At one point he describes Muhammad Ahmed, the slave trader who founded Mahdism, as a man inspired by a sincere religious zeal. At another point he makes him out a hypocrite and a charlatan. Father Ohrwalder was sharply criticized for that inconsistency. For our part we find nothing implausible about the two judgments, especially since they refer to two different periods in the Mahdi's life. Certainly the most disparate moral elements may function simultaneously in the same individual. That was the case with Infantin, the second high priest of Saint Simonianism, to whom a disciple in the latter days of the movement wrote, "Others criticize you for trying to pose all the time. I agree with you in thinking that posing is in your nature. It is your mission, your gift." Muhammad undeniably had a sincere and honest aspiration toward a religion that was less crude, less materialistic, than anything that had been practiced by the Arabs before his time. Nevertheless the verses of the Quran, which the Archangel Gabriel communicated to him one by one, arrived at most opportune moments to free him of irksome promises that he had made or from strict observance of moral laws that he had laid down for others in earlier verses. It became important for Muhammad at one time to increase the number of his wives to 7, in order that he might strengthen certain political ties and incidentally satisfy sentimental fancies. In the Quran he had expressly limited the number of legitimate wives to 4, and the precept had been proclaimed for all believers. But along came the Archangel Gabriel with a most convenient verse, which authorized the apostle of God to ignore his own injunction. To simplify our task, we have been implicitly assuming that the founder of every new religion or philosophical doctrine is a single individual. That is not strictly true. At times, when a reform is morally and intellectually ripe in a historical sense and finds an environment that is perfectly attuned to it, several masters may come forward simultaneously. That was the case with Protestantism, when Luther, Zwingli and Calvin began to preach almost at the same time. Sometimes the success of a first master breeds competition and plagiarism. Musaylama, for instance, and not a few others, tried to imitate Muhammad, proclaiming themselves in their turn prophets of Allah. More frequent is the case where an innovator does not succeed in developing his doctrine fully, much less in putting it into practice. Then one or a dozen continuators may arise, and fate the unfair may name the doctrine after one of them instead of the real founder. That seems to be happening in modern socialism, of which Marx is generally proclaimed the founder. Its first intellectual and moral parent was undoubtedly Rousseau. The master or masters who continue the work of the first founder must not be confused with the mere apostles, of whom we are about to speak. 4. About the individual who first formulates a new doctrine, there always gathers a more or less populous group that receives the word directly from the master's lips and is profoundly imbued with his sentiments. Every Messiah must have his apostles, since, and almost all the manifestations of his moral and material activity, the human being needs society. There is no enthusiasm that does not wane, no faith that does not falter, under prolonged isolation. The school, the church, the agape, the lodge, the regular meeting, any grouping, whatever it chances to be called, of persons who feel and think the same way, who have the same enthusiasms, the same hates, the same loves, the same interpretation of life, intensifies, exalts and develops their sentiments, and so works these into the character of each individual member that the stamp of the association is indelible upon him. Within this directing group, as a rule, the original inspiration of the master is developed, refined, worked out, so as to become a real political, religious or philosophical system, unblemished by too many inconsistencies and contradictions, or too obvious ones. Within this group the sacred fire of propaganda is kept burning even after the first author of the doctrine has vanished, and to this nucleus, which is recruited automatically by a process of selection and segregation, the future of the new doctrine is entrusted. However exceptional the master's originality of vision, his strength of feeling, his aptitude for propaganda, those qualities are without avail if he does not succeed in founding a school before his material or spiritual death, whereas, when the breath that animates the school is healthy and vigorous, all the inadequacies and flaws which may later be detected in the work of the founder can be overlooked or corrected little by little, and the propaganda will continue active and influential. Outside the directing nucleus comes the throng of proselytes. While this group constitutes the stronger element numerically, and supplies the church or party with its material strength and its economic basis, it is the most negligible factor intellectually and morally. A number of modern sociologists declare that the masses are conservative and messianistic cherry of novelties. That means that the masses are hard to win to a new faith. However, once they are won to it, they abandon it with the greatest reluctance, and when they do drop away, the fault lies almost always with the promoting nucleus. This latter group is always the first to be affected by indifference and skepticism. The best way to make others believe is to be profoundly convinced oneself. The art of arousing passion lies in one's own capacity for being intensely aroused. When the priest does not feel his faith, the congregation becomes indifferent and is ripe for conversion to some other doctrine that finds a more zealous minister. If the officer is not imbued with the military spirit, if he is not ready to give his life for the dignity of his flag, the soldier will not die at his post. If the sectarian is not a fanatic, he will never sweep the crowds into rebellion. In the case of ancient doctrines, or beliefs that have been established for some length of time and so have acquired traditions and fixed and circumscribed fields of activity, birth generally determines the individual's acceptance of them and his membership in the organizations that have formed around them. In Germany or the United States, one is almost always Catholic, Protestant or Jew, depending on the religion of the family into which one is born. In Spain and Italy, anyone who has any religion left is almost always a Catholic. But if a number of different doctrines are still in process of formation in a country, have active propagandas and are competing for adherence back and forth, then the personal choice of the individual of average intelligence depends upon a mass of circumstances, partly accidental and partly resulting from the skill with which the propaganda is carried on. In France, a young man becomes a conservative or a radical according as the ideas of his father, his teacher at school or his schoolmates chance to exercise the greater influence over him at the moment when his ideas begin to form. At an age when a boy's general ideas are still plastic and he is conscious mainly of a need to be aroused emotionally, to love or to hate something or someone, a book that comes into his hands, a newspaper to which he has daily access, may determine the whole trend of his afterlife. For many people, political, religious or philosophical opinions are, at bottom, very secondary matters, especially when the first flush of youth has passed and the age of practical occupations, of business, comes. So, to some extent through indolence, to some extent through habit, partly again through mistaken pride and respect for so-called consistency of character, a man often ends, when no strong conflict with his interests is involved, by keeping all his life long a doctrine that he embraced in a moment of youthful impulse, devoting to it such little energy and activity as the practical man is wont to set apart for what is called the ideal. However, from the fact that the individual's choice of a belief or a political party may largely be determined by chance, it does not follow that chance is the main factor in the success of any given school or church. Some doctrines are well suited to making proselytes, others are less so. Whether a political or religious teaching is to win wide acceptance depends almost exclusively on three factors. In the first place, it must be adapted to the given historical moment. In the second place, it must satisfy the greatest possible number of human passions, sentiments and inclinations, particularly such as are most widely diffused and most firmly rooted in the public. In the third place, it must have a well-organized directing nucleus, or executive committee, made up of individuals who consecrate their lives to the maintenance and propagation of the spirit that animates the faith. 5. For a doctrine to be adapted to a given historical moment in a given society, it must above all correspond to the degree of maturity which the human mind has attained at that moment in that society. A monotheistic religion will easily triumph when minds have progressed sufficiently to comprehend that all natural phenomena may be ascribed to one cause, and that the force that rules the universe is one. Rationalism can be taken as the basis of successful doctrines when free inquiry and the results of the natural and historical sciences have undermined belief in revealed religions, and the conception of a God created in the image and likeness of man and intervening arbitrarily in human events has come to seem absurd to the ruling classes. In the centuries when Christianity was spreading through the Roman Empire, almost everyone, pagans and Christians alike, believed in the supernatural and in miracles, but the pagan supernatural had become too gross and incoherent, while the Christian supernatural, besides better answering certain needs of the human spirit, was more systematic and less childish, and so was destined to triumph. Lucian was an utter skeptic, laughing at everyone, now at the pagans, now at the Christians. But he was an exception in the 2nd century of our era. The mean intelligence of the educated public of that time was better represented by Celsus, who was a deist and believed in the supernatural and in miracles but nevertheless ridiculed the Old and the New Testaments. But since Celsus had started out on the path which is so satisfactory to rationalists and which, in fact, 16 centuries later and under far different conditions, was to turn out so well for Voltaire, he should have seen that it would have been much easier to provoke ridicule and disgust for the disgraceful license and childish squabblings of the gods of Olympus than for the Christian histories. It is evident enough to us in our day that classical paganism had for some time been incapable of satisfying either the emotions or the intelligence of the people of that period. As Renan well observes, if the Greco-Roman world had not become Christian, it would have been converted to Mithraism, or to some other Asiatic religion that was at once more mystical than classical paganism and less incoherent. So it was with Rousseau. He emerged and prospered at a time when first humanism and the Reformation, then the progress of the exact and natural sciences, then finally Voltaire and the Encyclopedia, had discredited the whole Christian and medieval worlds, so that a new rational, we do not say reasonable, explanation of political institutions was in a position to win acceptance. If we analyze the lives of Luther and Mohammed, it is easy to see that at the time when they appeared, Germany and Arabia were ready to welcome their doctrines. When the human being has a certain culture and is not under any engrossing pressure of material needs, he generally manifests a tendency to rise above the ordinary preoccupations of life and interest himself in something higher than himself, something that concerns the interests of the society to which he belongs. It is much easier for a new doctrine to prosper, accordingly, in places and situations where this idealistic tendency is not able to find satisfaction in the political system in its prevailing forms, and where, therefore, a man's enthusiasms and ambitions, his love of combat, his instincts for leadership, do not find a ready outlet. Christianity would certainly not have spread so rapidly in Rome in the days of the Republic, when the state could offer its citizens the excitements of election campaigns, or when it was waging its terrible duel with Carthage. But the empire brought peace. It quieted conflicts between the nations and entrusted all public functions to salaried employees. That prepared the ground for a long period of security and political repose that rendered the new religion the best possible service. In the age just past, the consolidation of the bureaucratic state, the ending of religious wars, the growth of a cultured, well-to-do class that had no part in political functions, supplied the basis first for the liberal and then for the radical socialist movements. Nations sometimes have periods of, so to say, psychological exhaustion, when they seem to need repose. That is what we mean when we say, with less aptness of phrase, perhaps, that a people has grown old. At any rate, if a society has had no revolutions and undergone no serious political changes for some centuries, when it begins at last to emerge from its long torpor, it is much more easily persuaded that the triumph of a new doctrine, the establishment of a new form of government, will mark the beginning of a new era, a new golden age, and that on its advent all men will become good and happy in a new land of Cathay. That was the characteristic illusion in France around 1789. It was to an extent the illusion in Italy in 1848. On the other hand, after a series of disturbances and changes, the enthusiasm and faith that political innovators and political novelties have inspired tends to fall off considerably, and a vague feeling of skepticism and fatigue spreads through the masses. However, capacity for faith and enthusiasm is exhausted far less readily than might appear at first sight. Disillusionment has little effect, on the whole, upon religious doctrines that are based on the supernatural, that solve problems relating to the prime cause of the universe or that postpone realization of the ideals of happiness and justice to another life. But strangely enough, even doctrines that are apparently more realistic and should yield their fruits in this life succeed very well in surviving the refutations of them that are supplied by experience and the facts of everyday living. After all, illusions endure because illusion is a need for almost all men, a need that they feel no less strongly than their material needs. A system of illusions, therefore, is not easily discredited until it can be replaced with a new system. As we often see, when that is not possible, not even a sequence of sufferings, of terrible trials born of experiences more terrible still, is enough to disenchant a people, or, more exactly, discouragement rather than disillusionment settles upon that people and endures as long as the generation that has personally suffered still lives. But after that, if there has been no change in the trend of ideas and in the education of sentiments, the moment social energies have somewhat revived, the same illusions produce new conflicts and new misfortunes over again. Moreover, it is in the nature of men to retain favorable memories of the days during which they suffered, and of the individuals who caused their sufferings. That is the case especially when a certain length of time has elapsed. The masses always end by admiring and draping in poetic legend leaders like Napoleon, who have brought untold pain and misfortune upon them but who at the same time have satisfied their need for ennobling emotions and their fantastic craving for novelties and great things. 6. The capacity of a doctrine to satisfy the needs of the human spirit depends not only upon requirements of time and place but also upon conditions that are independent of time and place, upon basic psychological laws that must not be disregarded. In fact, this second element in the success of ambitious political and religious doctrines is an exceedingly important one. As a general rule, if a system of ideas, beliefs, feelings, is to be accepted by great masses of human beings, it must address the loftier sentiments of the human spirit, it must promise that justice and equality will reign in this world, or in some other, or it must proclaim that the good will be rewarded and the wicked punished. At the same time, it will not go far wrong if it yields some small satisfaction to the envy and rancor that are generally felt toward the powerful and the fortunate, ere it intimates that, in this life or in some other, there will come a time when the last shall be first and the first last. It will help if some phase of the doctrine can manage to offer a refuge for good souls, gentle souls, who seek in meditation and resignation some solace from the conflicts and disappointments of life. It will be useful, also, one might even say indispensable, for the doctrine to have some means of utilizing the spirit of abnegation and sacrifice that predominates in certain individuals and of guiding it into proper channels, though the same doctrine must also leave some little elbow room for pride and vanity. It follows, therefore, that believers must always be the people or the better people, or progressive spirits, who speak for the vanguard of real progress. So the Christian must be enabled to think with complacency that everybody not of the Christian faith will be damned. The Brahman must be given grounds for rejoicing that he alone is descended from the head of Brahma and has the exalted honor of reading the sacred books. The Buddhist must be taught highly to prize the privilege he has of attaining nirvana soonest. The Mohammedan must recall with satisfaction that he alone is the true believer and that all others are infidel dogs in this life and tormented dogs in the next. The radical socialist must be convinced that all who do not think as he does are either selfish, money-spoiled bourgeois or ignorant and servile simpletons. These are all examples of arguments that provide for one's need of esteeming one's self in one's own religion or convictions, and at the same time for the need of despising and hating others. From hatred to conflict is only a step. In fact, there is no political party or religious sect that does not envisage war, bloody or not, as the case may turn out, upon those who do not accept its dogmas. If it eschews conflict altogether and preaches compassion and submission in all cases, that is just a sign that it is conscious of weakness and thinks it would be risking too much in undertaking a war. In struggle, besides, all the less noble but nonetheless widespread appetites of the human heart are taken account of: love of luxury, lust for blood and women, ambition to command and to tyrannize. Certainly no recipe can be given for founding an enduring political party or religious doctrine that will contain the exact dosages required for satisfying every human sentiment. But one may declare with all assurance that to realize the purpose mentioned there must be a fusion, in certain amounts, of lofty sentiments and low passions, of precious metal and base metal, otherwise the alloy will not stand the wear and tear. A doctrine that does not take sufficient account of the differing and contradictory qualities that human nature shows has little power of appeal, and it will have to be revamped in that respect if it is to gain a permanent following. The mingling of good and evil is so inborn in human nature that a certain amount of fine metal must be present even in the alloys of which criminal gangs, secret societies and murderous sects are compounded, and a little of the base metal must enter into the complex of sentiments that inspires companies of heroes and ascetic communities that make a fetish of self-sacrifice. Too great a deficiency, therefore, of either the good or the bad elements always has the same results. It prevents any wide dissemination of the doctrine, or the special discipline, that the given sect enforces upon its members. There have been, as there still are, organized groups of bandits that preach theft, murder and the destruction of property. But in such cases the perpetration of the criminal act is almost always colored with some specious political or religious doctrine that serves to decoy into the company some misguided person who is not wholly contemptible, whose crumb of respectability renders common turpitude more bearable to the public and introduces into the association a modicum of moral sense that is indispensable if a villainy is to succeed. Bismarck is credited with the apothegm that a man needs a little honesty to be a perfect rascal. The Sicilian Mafia, among other criminal associations, had its rules of ethics, and its members a certain sense of honor. The mafiosi sometimes kept their word with non-members, and they rarely betrayed each other. It is mainly to the limitations they set to their wrongdoing that certain criminal associations owe their extraordinarily long lives. Macaulay observes that murder plots almost never succeed in England proper because English murderers lack the grain of moral sense that is essential to mutual trust. He may have been right or wrong as to the fact, the corollary he derives from it is certainly sound. We have an example of societies of the type mentioned in The Assassins, who ravaged Syria and Iraq Araby in the Middle Ages. The Assassins were a degenerate wing of the Ismailians, a relatively innocuous sect that had a wide following in the Mohammedan world about the year 1100. The doctrine and discipline of the sect had many points in common with present-day Freemasonry in the Latin countries. The thugs, or stragglers, were famous in India down to the middle of the last century. Almost all travelers who have written about China speak of secret societies. Some of them are countrywide and have, or pretend to have, strictly political objectives. To the list might be added the underground political movements that are common today in Europe and America. On the other hand, certain associations of human beings are founded upon the renunciation of every worldly vanity and pleasure, on the complete sacrifice of the member's personality, either to the advantage of the association or to the advantage of all humanity. The Bonds convents in the Buddhist world and the Catholic religious orders in the West are familiar examples of this type of institution. These associations are in general recruited from among individuals who are specially fitted for their calling, either through peculiar circumstances in their personal lives or through a natural inclination toward self-sacrifice and resignation. We cannot say, however, that they are wholly exempt from worldly passions. A desire to win the admiration of the devout, the ambition of many individuals to excel within the order, and an even stronger ambition that the order shall surpass rival orders, these are all powerful motives that have contributed to the long and prosperous lives of such associations. But in all these cases, though we see that a bit of good is always found mixed in with the evil, and that a bit of evil always sours the good, we are still confronted by the fact that such associations are still none too large. They have never embraced all the members of a great human society. In spite of all the specious justifications of crime that have been devised, sects of murderers and thieves have never been more than diseased social excrescences. They may have succeeded for a time in terrorizing, or even influencing, wide areas. They have never converted a great people to their principles. The monastery too has always been an exception, and wherever the monastic life has spread and become the habitual occupation of any considerable part of a population, the order has rapidly strayed from its original principles. The Ebionite churches of early Christian days required all the faithful to pool their earnings, and they sought to extend the monastic type over all Christian society. However, the sect led a hand-to-mouth existence and soon disappeared, for if any amount of abnegation may be obtained from a small number of chosen individuals who are trained by an apposite discipline, the same thing is not possible with a whole human mass, in which the good is necessarily mingled with the bad and needs and passions of all sorts have to be reckoned with. For that reason, if an experiment in social regeneration is to prove anything, it has to be applied to an entire people, granted that one can be found to lend itself to such an experiment or can be forced to do so. 7. For all these reasons, a religion with too lofty a moral system produces at the most those good, and indeed far from disparageable, results that come from a man's making an effort to attain an ideal that lies beyond his powers of attainment. But in practice such a religion must end by being observed with scant scrupulousness. The continuous conflict between religious belief and human necessity, between the thing recognized as holy and conforming with divine law and the thing that is done, and indeed has to be done, constitutes the eternal contradiction, the inevitable hypocrisy, that appears in the lives of many peoples, and by no means of Christian peoples only. A short time before Christianity became, thanks to Constantine, the official religion of the Roman Empire, the good Lactantius exclaimed, "If only the true God were honored, that is, if all men were converted to Christianity, there would be no more dissensions or wars. Men would all be united by the ties of an indissoluble love, for they would all look upon each other as brothers. No one would contrive further snares to be rid of his neighbor. Each would be content with little, and there would be no more frauds and thefts. How blessed then would be man's estate! What a golden age would dawn upon the world." Such, in fact, had to be the opinion of a Christian, for he was convinced that every believer should put the precepts and spirit of his religion integrally into practice, and thought it quite possible for a whole society to observe them as they were observed by those chosen spirits who, at the cost of their lives, refused to deny their faith in the face of Diocletian's persecution. But if Lactantius had lived only 50 years longer, he might have perceived that no religion can of itself raise the moral level of an entire people very rapidly or to any great extent. Had he been reborn in the Middle Ages, he could have satisfied himself that by adapting itself more and more to shifting historical circumstances and to the perennial demands of the human spirit, the same religion that had supplied the martyr and was supplying the missionary could just as readily supply the crusader and the inquisitor. Mohammedans in general observe the Quran far more scrupulously than Christians observe the Gospel, but that is due not only to a blinder faith, which in turn is due to a lower scientific level, but also to the fact that the prescriptions of Muhammad are morally less lofty, and so are humanly more realizable, than the prescriptions of Jesus. Those who practice Islamism in general abstain very strictly from wine and pork, but an individual who has never tasted wine or pork feels no appreciable discomfort if he is deprived of them. For that matter, it seems that when Mussulmans have lived with Christians in countries that produce wine extensively, they have observed the precepts of the Prophet on the subject of intoxicating liquors less scrupulously. The history of the Saracens in Sicily shows not a few cases of drunkenness among Mohammedans. Ibn el-Theman, emir of Catania, was in a state of complete intoxication when he ordered the veins of his wife, a sister of the emir of Palermo, to be opened. An Arab poet, Ibn Hamdiz, sang the praises of the good wine of Syracuse, its amber color and its musk-like fragrance. Adultery, again, is much rarer among adherents of Islam than among Christians, but divorce is much easier among the former, and Muhammad allows a man several wives and does not prohibit relations with slaves. Believers in Islam are strongly advised to give alms to members of their faith and to be lavish with them in every sort of assistance, but they are also taught that to exterminate infidels in war and to levy tribute on them in peace are meritorious acts. At bottom, therefore, the Quran serves prescriptions to suit all tastes, and, if one remains faithful to it in the letter and the spirit, one can get to paradise by any number of broad highways. Not a few Islamic doctrines, meantime, chance to conflict with some of the stronger and more deeply rooted instincts of human nature. They are the ones that least influence the conduct of Mussulmans. Muhammad, for instance, promises paradise to all who fall in a holy war. Now if every believer were to guide his conduct by that assurance in the Quran, every time a Mohammedan army found itself faced by unbelievers it ought either to conquer or to fall to the last man. It cannot be denied that a certain number of individuals do live up to the letter of the Prophet's word, but as between defeat and death followed by eternal bliss, the majority of Mohammedans normally elect defeat. Buddhists, in general, are strict in observing the outward precepts of their religion, Yet in putting the spirit of the precepts into practice they are as deft as the Christians at avoiding embarrassment by making, to use Moliere's phrase, their arrangements with heaven. The next to the last king of Burma was the wise and canny Mudum Men. Besides governing his subjects well, he had an enthusiastic interest in religious and philosophical discussion and regularly summoned to his presence all Englishmen and Europeans of distinction who passed through Mandalay, the capital of his dominions. In his discourses with them he always upheld the superiority of Buddhist ethics to the morals preached by other religions and never failed to call the attention of his guests to the fact that the conduct of Christians did not always conform to the precepts of Christian doctrine. Certainly it could have cost him no great effort to show that the behavior of the English in wresting a portion of Burmese territory from his predecessor was in no way consistent with the gospel. He, on his side, had been brought up in a bonze monastery. He conscientiously observed the prescriptions of Buddha. At his court no animal was ever slaughtered, and Europeans who stayed there for any length of time found the vegetable diet irksome and were obliged secretly to fill out by hunting birds' eggs in the woods. Not only that, Mudum Men would never, for any reason in the world, order a capital execution. In fact, when anybody's presence inconvenienced him too seriously, the wily monarch would merely ask of his prime minister whether so-and-so were still of this world. And when, after many repetitions of the question, the prime minister would finally answer no, Mudum Men would smile contentedly. He had violated no precept of his religion but still had made his point, which was that a certain human soul should begin somewhat earlier than might normally have been expected the series of transmigrations that leads at last, as the Buddhist faith assures, to fusion with the universal soul. The doctrine of the ancient Stoics was essentially virile and, except, perhaps, as regards pose and vanity, which were common frailties among them, made little, if any, concession to the passions, weaknesses or sentiments of men. But for that very reason the influence of Stoicism was limited to a section of the cultured classes. The pagan masses remained wholly alien to its propaganda. The Stoic school may have helped, at certain periods, to form the character of a part of the ruling class in the Roman Empire. To it, undoubtedly, a number of good emperors owed their training. But from the moment that its members no longer cluttered the steps of a throne it was completely ineffectual. Powerless to change, because its intellectual and strictly philosophical side quite overshadowed its dogmatic and emotional sides, it could not compete with Christianity for control of the Roman world, and it would have succeeded no better in competition with Judaism, Islam or Buddhism. One could not maintain that it makes no difference whether a people embraces one religion or political doctrine or another. It would be difficult to show that the practical effects of Christianity are not different from those of Mohammedanism or socialism. In the long run a belief does give a certain bent to human sentiments, and such bents may have far-reaching consequences. But it seems certain that no belief will ever succeed in making the human being anything essentially different from what he is. To state the situation in other words, no belief will ever make man wholly good or wholly bad, wholly altruistic or wholly selfish. Some adaptation to the lower moral and emotional level that corresponds to the human average is indispensable in all religions. Those who refuse to recognize that fact make it easier, it seems to us, for people who use the relative inefficacy of religious sentiments and political doctrines as an argument to prove their absolute inefficacy. There comes to mind in this connection an opinion that has often been expressed. The bandits of southern Italy usually went about in true South Italian style, laden with scapulars and images of saints and Madonnas. At the same time they were often guilty of murders and other crimes, whence the conclusion that religious beliefs had no practical influence upon them. Now, before such an inference could with justice be drawn, one would have to show that if the bandits had not carried scapulars and Madonnas they would not have committed additional murders or acts of ferocity. If the images saved a single human life, a single pang of sorrow, a single tear, there would be adequate grounds for crediting them with some influence. 8. As we have seen, section 4, above, a third factor figures in the spread and survival of any system of religious or political ideas, namely, the organization of the directing nucleus and the means it employs for converting the masses or holding them loyal to a given belief or doctrine. As we also have seen, the nucleus originates in the first instance in a spontaneous process of selection and segregation. Thereafter its cohesion is based in the main on a phenomenon of the human spirit which we have called mimetism, or imitation, the tendency of an individual's passions, sentiments and beliefs to develop in accord with the currents that prevail in the environment in which he is morally formed and educated. It is altogether natural that in a country that has attained some degree of culture a certain number of young people should have a capacity for developing enthusiasms about what they hold to be true and ethical, about ideas which, in semblance at least, are generous and lofty and concern the destiny of a nation or of humanity at large. These sentiments and the spirit of abnegation and self-sacrifice that result from them may remain in a state of potentiality and become atrophied, or they may enjoy a luxuriant blossoming, according as they are cultivated or not, and the fruits they yield differ widely according to the differing ways in which they are cultivated. In the son of a shopkeeper who comes into contact with no one except the customers and clerks in his father's place of business, the sentiments mentioned will probably never amount to very much or even manifest themselves at all, unless the boy be one of those rare individuals of superior type who succeed in developing all by themselves. A young man who receives a religious training from his earliest childhood and then goes on to a Catholic seminary may become a missionary and consecrate his whole life to the triumph of his faith. Another, who is born into a family that has a coat of arms, is educated in a military academy and then becomes a lieutenant in a regiment, where he finds comrades and superiors who are all imbued with the same sort of convictions, will think it his first and all-embracing duty to obey the orders of his sovereign all his life long and, if need be, to get himself killed for his king. Another, finally, who is born into an environment of veteran conspirators and revolutionaries, who has thrilled and shuddered from his earliest days at tales of political persecutions and riots at the barricades, and whose mind has been fed largely on the writings of Rousseau, Mazzini or Marx, will deem it his sacred duty to struggle tirelessly against oppression by organized government, and will be ready to face prison and the gallows in the name of revolution. All that occurs because once the individual's environment is formed, Catholic, ecclesiastical, bureaucratic, military, revolutionary, as it may be, that individual, especially if he is a normal young man not altogether superior in intellect nor yet utterly vulgar and commonplace, will give to his sentimental and affective faculties the bent that the environment suggests to him, so that certain sentiments rather than others will develop in him, the spirit of rebellion and struggle, say, rather than the spirit of passive obedience and self-sacrifice. This training, this dressage, as the French call it, succeeds better with the young than with adults, with enthusiastic and impassioned temperaments better than with cold, deliberate, calculating temperaments, with docile souls better than with rebellious spirits, unless the doctrine, whether in essence or because of special historical circumstances, makes a point of cultivating and intensifying the rebellious instincts. One condition especially is favorable, not to say indispensable, to this mimetic process, the process by which the individual is assimilated to the environment. The environment must be closed to all influences from outside, so that no sentiments, and especially no ideas, will ever get into it except such as bear the trademark of the environment. No book that is on the index must ever enter the seminary. Philosophy must begin and end with St. Thomas Aquinas. When one reads, one must read theology and the works of the fathers. The tales that are offered to the child's curiosity and hunger for romance will be tales of martyrs and heroic confessors. In the military academy one will read and talk of the exploits of great captains, of the glories of one's own army and one's own dynasty. Education and training will be such as are strictly required for learning the soldier's profession and for coming to prize highly the honor of being an officer, a gentleman, a loyal champion of king and country. In the revolutionary study hour the talk will be all on the victories and glories of the sinless masses, on the nefarious doings of tyrants and their hirelings, on the greed and baseness of the bourgeoisie, and any book which is not written in accordance with the word and spirit of the masters will be mercilessly proscribed. Any glimmer of mental balance, any ray of light from other moral and intellectual worlds, that strays into one of these closed environments produces doubts, falterings and desertions. Real history, that earnest, objective search for facts, the discipline which teaches us to know men and appraise them independently of caste, religion or political party, which takes account of their weaknesses and virtues for what they really are, which trains and exercises the faculties of observation and the sense of reality, must be completely banned. Now that, at bottom, means nothing more or less than a real unbalancing of the spirit, and every environment inflicts that unbalancing upon the recruit who is drawn into its orbit. He is offered only a partial picture of life. That picture has been carefully revised, circumscribed and corrected, and the neophyte must take it as the whole and real picture of life. Certain sentiments are overstressed, certain others are minimized, and an idea of justice, honesty, duty, is presented which, if not fundamentally wrong, is certainly grossly incomplete. This thoroughgoing identification of the concept of justice and right with the given religious or political doctrine, even a morally lofty one, sometimes drives upright but violent souls to extreme fanaticism and political crimes, and may even succeed in extinguishing all gracious sentiment in a chivalrous people. According to an anecdote relating to Muhammad, a battle was being fought at Onin between the Prophet's followers and his opponents during his lifetime. In the ranks of the dissidents was one Dorkal ben Sana, the Bayard of his age and people. Though 90 years old, he had himself carried to the battlefield on a litter. A young Islamite, one Ribiah ben Rifai, managed to reach the spot where Doriad was and struck him with a well-aimed blow of his sword. But the weapon fell to pieces. "What a wretched sword your father gave you, boy," said the old hero. "My scimitar has a real temper. Take it, and then go and tell your mother that you have slain Doriad with the weapon with which he so many times defended the liberty and good right of the Arabs, and the honor of their women." Ribiah took Doriad's scimitar and slew him, and then went so far in his cynical rage as in fact to carry the message to his mother. Less fanatical than her son about the new religion, perhaps because she was a woman of the old school, she seems to have received him with the contempt he deserved. And yet, as we have seen, section 8, above, perfectly balanced individuals, who know and appreciate all their duties and give to each the importance that it really has, are not likely to devote all their lives and energies to achieving one particular and definite thing. Mass exaggerations, or if one prefer, mass illusions, are the things that produce great events in history and make the world move. If a Christian could grant that a person could be just as virtuous without baptism, or that one could be without the faith and still save one's soul, the Christian missionaries and martyrs would have lost their enthusiasm, and Christianity would not have become the factor that it became in human history. If the promoters of a revolution were convinced that the status of society would not be very much better the morning after their victory, if they even suspected that there might be a chance of their making things worse, it would be hard to sweep them in droves to the barricades. Nations in which the critical spirit is strong, and which are skeptical, very properly skeptical, as to the practical benefits that any new doctrine can bring, never take the lead in great social movements and end by being dragged along by others whose enthusiasms are more readily aroused. The same is true of the individuals within a nation. The more sensible end very frequently by being swept off their feet by the more impulsive. Not always is it the sane who lead the mad. Often the mad force the sane to keep them company. 9. But once the heroic period of a movement is over, once the stage of initial propaganda comes to an end, then reflection and self-interest claim their rights again. Enthusiasm, the spirit of sacrifice, the one-sided view, are enough to found religious and political parties. They are not enough to spread them very far abroad and assure them of a permanent existence. So the method of recruiting the directing nucleus is modified or, better, completed. Membership among the individuals who make up the nucleus may still be won on purely idealistic grounds, but the age when idealism is everything soon passes in the great majority of human beings. They must then find something to satisfy ambition, vanity, and the craving for material pleasures. In a word, along with a center of ideas and sentiments, one must have a center of interests. Here again we come upon the theory of the alloy of pure metal with base that we formulated previously. A ruling nucleus that is really well organized must find a place within itself for all sorts of characters, for the man who yearns to sacrifice himself for others and the man who wants to exploit his neighbor for his own profit, for the man who wants to look powerful, and the man who wants to be powerful without regard to looks, for the man who enjoys suffering and privations and the man who likes to enjoy the good things of life. When all these elements are fused and disciplined into a strongly knit system, within which every individual knows that as long as he remains loyal to the purposes and policy of the institution his inclinations will be gratified, and that if he rebels against it he may be morally and even materially destroyed, we get one of those social organisms that defy the most varied historical vicissitudes and endure for thousands of years. One thinks at once of the Catholic Church, which has been and still is the most robust and typical of all such organisms. We can only stand in rapt admiration before the complexity and the shrewdness of its organization. The seminary student, the novice, the sister of charity, the missionary, the preacher, the mendicant friar, the opulent abbot, the aristocratic prior, the rural priest, the wealthy archbishop, sometimes also the sovereign prince, the cardinal, who takes precedence over prime ministers, the pope, who is one of the most powerful of temporal rulers down to a few centuries ago, all have their place, all have their raison d'etre, in the Church. Macaulay has pointed to a great advantage that Catholicism has over Protestantism. When an enthusiastic, unbalanced spirit arises inside the Protestant fold, he always ends by discovering some new interpretation of the Bible and founding one more of the many sects into which the Reformation has split. That same individual would be utilized to perfection by Catholicism and become an element of strength rather than of dispersion. He would don a friar's robe, he would become a famous preacher and, if he had a really original character, a truly warm heart, and if historical circumstances favored, he would become a Saint Francis of Assisi or a Saint Ignatius Loyola. Cogent as this example is, however, it shows only one of the countless ways in which the Catholic hierarchy manages to profit by all human aptitudes. It is said that the celibacy rule for the clergy goes contrary to nature, and certainly for some men to be deprived of a legal family would be a very great sacrifice. But it must be remembered that only at that price can a militia that is free of all private affections and stands apart from the rest of society be obtained, and, meantime, for characters that have an inclination toward celibacy, that institution itself does not preclude certain material satisfactions. In the same way, many people believe that the Church has degenerated and lost strength and influence because it has deviated from its origins and ceased to be exclusively a handmaiden of the poor. But that too is a superficial and therefore erroneous judgment. Perhaps nowadays, in this age of ours, when everybody is talking about the disinherited classes and is interested, or pretends to be interested, in them, it might be becoming in the Supreme Pontiff to remember a little oftener that he is the servant of the servants of God. But except for certain fleeting periods in history, the Catholic Church would not have been what it has been, and it would not have endured so long in glory and prosperity, if it had always confined itself to being an institution for the sole benefit of the poor and had been popular only among beggars. Instead, it has shrewdly found ways to enjoy the approval of both the poor and the rich. To the poor it has offered alms and consolation. The rich it has won with its splendor and with the satisfactions it has been able to provide for their vanity and pride. So well chosen has this policy proved that if the enemies of the Church have always reproached it for its luxury and worldliness, they have always, if they have been shrewd, taken care to derive as much influence and wealth from it as possible. Of late, in a number of European countries, another institution has been devoting all its energies to combating the Catholic Church. But for its own part, it does not fail to procure for its adherents as many personal satisfactions and material advantages as possible. 10. Once the ruling nucleus is organized, the methods that it uses to win the masses and keep them loyal to its doctrine may be widely various. When no serious external obstacles, or obstacles arising from the nature of the political or religious system itself, are encountered, both methods of propaganda that are based upon the gradual persuasion and education of the masses and methods that involve the resort to force yield good results. Force, in fact, is perhaps the quickest means of establishing a conviction or idea, though naturally only the stronger can use it. In the 19th century it became a widespread belief that force and persecution were powerless against doctrines that were founded upon truth, since the future belonged to such doctrines. They were regarded as equally useless against mistaken beliefs, since popular good sense would attend to them on its own account. Now, to be quite frank, it is hard to find a notion that involves a greater superficiality of observation and a greater inexperience of historical fact. That surely will be one of the ideas of our time that will give posterity the heartiest laughs at our expense. That such a theory should be preached by parties and sects which do not as yet hold power in their hands is easily understandable. Their instincts of self-interest and self-preservation might lead them to profess such views. Stupidity begins when it is accepted by others. Quid est veritas? Asked Pilate, and we can begin by asking what a true doctrine is and what a false doctrine is. Scientifically speaking, all religious doctrines are false, regardless of the number of believers they may have or may have had. No one, certainly, will maintain that Mohammedanism, for instance, which has conquered so large a portion of the world, is founded upon scientific truth. It is much more accurate to say that there are doctrines that satisfy sentiments which are widespread and very deeply rooted in the human heart and, accordingly, have greater powers of self-propagation, and that there are doctrines that possess the quality mentioned to a lesser degree and therefore, though they may be more acceptable on the intellectual side, have a far more limited appeal. If one will, a distinction can be drawn between doctrines which it is to the interest of civilization and justice to have widely accepted, and which produce a greater sum of peace, morality and human welfare, and doctrines which have the opposite effects and which, unfortunately, are not always the ones that show the least capacity for self-propagation. We believe that social democracy threatens the future of modern civilization, yet we are obliged to recognize that it is based on the sentiment of justice, on envy, on the craving for pleasures, and those qualities are so widespread among men, especially in our day, that it would be a great mistake to deny that socialist doctrines have very great powers of self-propagation. People always point to the case of Christianity, which triumphed in spite of persecutions, and to modern liberalism, which overcame the tyrants who tried to repress it. But these eases merely show that when persecution is badly managed it cannot do everything, and that there may be cases where pure force does not suffice to arrest a current of ideas. The exception, however, cannot serve as a basis for a general principle. If a persecution is badly managed, tardily undertaken, laxly and falteringly applied, it almost always helps to further the triumph of a doctrine, whereas a pitiless and energetic persecution, which strikes at the opposing doctrine the moment it shows its head, is the very best tool for combating it. Christianity was not always persecuted energetically in the Roman Empire. It had long periods of toleration, and oftentimes the persecutions themselves were only partial, They were confined, that is, to a few provinces. It did not definitely triumph, however, until an emperor who held constituted authority in his hands began to favor it. So too, liberal propaganda was not only hampered, it was also furthered, by governments from the middle of the 18th century down to the French Revolution. Later on it was fought intermittently and never simultaneously through all the European world. It triumphed when the governments themselves were converted to it, or else were overthrown by force, internal or from abroad. As compared with those two doubtful examples, how many others there are to the precise contrary. Christianity itself in its early days hardly spread beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire. It was not accepted in Persia, not only because it met an obstacle in the Persian national religion, but because it was energetically persecuted. Charlemagne planted Christianity among the Saxons by fire and sword and within the space of a generation. The evangelization of the Roman Empire took centuries. A few years sufficed to carry the gospel to many barbarian countries, because once a king and his nobles were converted, the people bent their necks to baptism en masse. The cross was set up in that very summary manner in the various Anglo-Saxon dominions, in Poland, in Russia, in the Scandinavian countries and in Lithuania. In the 17th century, the Christian religion was almost wiped out in Japan by a pitiless and therefore effective persecution. Buddhism was eradicated by persecution from India, its motherland, Mazdaism from the Persia of the Sassanids, Babism from modern Persia and the new religion of the Taipings from China. Thanks to persecution, the Albigenses disappeared from southern France, and Mohammedanism and Judaism from Spain and Sicily. The Reformation triumphed, after all, only in countries where it was supported by governments and, in some cases, by a victorious revolution. The rapid rise of Christianity itself, which is ascribed to a miracle, is nothing as compared with the far more rapid rise of Mohammedanism. The former spread over the territory of the Roman Empire in 3 centuries. The latter in just 80 years expanded from Samarkand to the Pyrenees. Christianity, however, worked only by preaching and persuasion. The other showed a decided preference for the scimitar. The fact that all political parties and religious creeds tend to exert an influence upon those in power and, whenever they can, to monopolize power itself, is the best proof that even if they do not openly confess it, they are convinced that to control all the more effective forces in a social organism, and especially a bureaucratic state, is the best way to spread and maintain a doctrine. 11. As regards the other means, apart from physical force, which the various religions and political parties use to attract the masses, maintain ascendancy over them and exploit their credulity, we may say very largely what we said of the obligation that founders of doctrines, and doctrines themselves, are under to adapt themselves to a fairly low moral level. The followers of every political or religious system are wont carefully to list the faults of their adversaries in respect of moral practices, while claiming to be free of any reproach themselves. As a matter of fact, all of them, with differences in degree to be sure, are tarred with the same brush. It is our privilege to be perfectly moral so long as we do not come into contact with other men, and especially so long as we make no pretensions to guiding them. But once we set out to direct their conduct, we are obliged to play upon all the sensitive springs of conduct that we can touch in them. We have to take advantage of all their weaknesses, and anyone who would appeal only to their generous sentiments would be easily beaten by someone else who was less scrupulous. States are not run with prayer books, said Cosimo de' Medici, the father of his country. And indeed it is very hard to lead the masses in a given direction when one is not able as need requires to flatter passions, satisfy whims and appetites and inspire fear. Of course, if a man, however wicked he might be, tried to rule a state strictly on blasphemy, that is to say by relying exclusively upon material interests and the baser sentiments, he would be just as ingenuous as the man who tried to govern with prayer books alone. If old Cosimo were alive, he would not hesitate to call such a man a fool. By a sufficient display of energy, self-sacrifice, restless activity, patience and, where necessary, superior technical skill, the man at the helm of a state may feel less in need of exploiting the baser sentiments, and may place great dependence upon the generous and virtuous instincts of his subjects. But the head of a state is only a man, and so does not always possess the qualities mentioned in any eminent degree. One notes, on close inspection, that the artifices that are used to wheedle crowds are more or less alike at all times and in all places, since the problem is always to take advantage of the same human weaknesses. All religions, even those that deny the supernatural, have their special declamatory style, and their sermons, lectures or speeches are delivered in it. All of them have their rituals and their displays of pomp to strike the fancy. Some parade with lighted candles and chant litanies. Others march behind red banners to the tune of the Marseillaise or the International. Religions and political parties alike take advantage of the vain and create ranks, offices and distinctions for them. Alike they exploit the simple, the ingenuous and those eager for self-sacrifice or for publicity, in order to create the martyr. Once the martyr has been found, they take care to keep his cult alive, since that serves very effectively to strengthen faith. Once upon a time it was a practice in monasteries to choose the silliest of the friars and accredit him as a saint, even ascribing miracles to him, all with a view to enhancing the renown of the brotherhood and hence its wealth and influence, which were straightway turned to good account by those who had directed the staging of the farce. In our day sects and political parties are highly skilled at creating the Superman, the legendary hero, the man of unquestioned honesty, who serves, in his turn, to maintain the luster of the gang and brings in wealth and power for the sly ones to use. When my uncle the Count reminded the Capuchin Father Provincial of the scalawag tricks that Father Christopher had played in his youth, the Father Provincial promptly replied that it was to the glory of the cloth that one who had caused scandal in the world should become quite a different person on taking the cloth. A typically monkish reply, without doubt. But worse than monks are political parties and sects which conceal and excuse the worst rascalities of their adherents so long as they are loyal to the colors. For them, whoever takes the cloth becomes on the spot a quite different person. The complex of dissimulation, artifice and stratagem that commonly goes by the name of Jesuitism is not peculiar to the followers of Loyola. Perhaps the Jesuits had the honor of lending it their name because they systematized the thing, perfected it and in a way made an art of it, but, after all, the Jesuitical spirit is just a form of the sectarian spirit carried to its ultimate implications. All religions and all parties which have set out with more or less sincere enthusiasms to lead men towards specified goals have, with more or less moderation, used methods similar to the methods of the Jesuits, and sometimes worse ones. The principle that the end justifies the means has been adopted for the triumph of all causes and all social and political systems. All parties, all cults, make it a rule to judge only that man great who fights in the party ranks, all other men are idiots or rogues. When they can do nothing more positive, they maintain obstinate silence on the merits of outsiders. All sectarians practice the art of holding to the form and letter of their word while violating it in substance. All of them know how to distort a recital of facts to their advantage. All of them know how to find simple, timid souls and how to capture their loyalty and win their assistance and their contributions for the cause and for the persons who represent it and are its apostles. Unfortunately, therefore, even if the Jesuits were to disappear, Jesuitism would remain, and we have only to look about us to be convinced of that truth. The more blatantly unscrupulous means are oftenest used in associations that are in conflict with constituted authorities and are more or less secret in character. Among the instructions that Bakunin sent out to his followers, we find this one. To reach the gloomy city of Pandestruction, the first requisite is a series of assassinations, a series of hold and perhaps crazy enterprises which will strike terror to the hearts of the powerful and dazzle the populace into believing in the triumph of the revolution. Couched in cruder language, Bakunin's maxims remind one of the be agitated and agitate of another great revolutionist. In the same pamphlet, Principles of Revolution, Bakunin goes on. Without recognizing any activity other than destruction, we declare that the forms in which that activity should manifest itself are variety itself, poison, dagger, knout. Revolution sanctifies everything without distinction. Another Russian, who came to hold principles very different from Bakunin's, describes in a novel the methods by which the wily attract the ingenuous into revolutionary societies. Says Dostoevsky. First of all, the bureaucratic bait is necessary. There have to be titles, presidents, secretaries, and so on. Then comes sentimentality, which is a most effective agent, and then regard for what people may think. Fear of being alone in one's opinion and fear of passing for an anti-liberal are things that have tremendous power. Then, adds another interlocutor in the dialogue, there is the trick of embroiling unsuspecting neophytes in a crime. 5 comrades murder a 6th on the pretext that he is a spy. Murder cements everything. There is no escape even for the most reluctant. 12. The day can hardly come when conflicts and rivalries among different religions and parties will end. That would be possible only if all the civilized world were to belong to a single social type, to a single religion, and if there were to be an end to disagreements as to the ways in which social betterment can be attained. Now a number of German writers believe that political parties are necessary as corresponding to the various tendencies that manifest themselves at different ages in the human being. Without accepting that theory, we can readily observe that any new religion, any new political dogma that chances to win some measure of success, straightway breaks up into sects, under pressure of the instinct for disputing and quarreling, and these sects fight one another with the same zest and the same bitterness that the parent faith formerly displayed against rival religions and parties. The numerous schisms and heresies that are forever sprouting in Christianity, Mohammedanism and the many other religions, the divisions that keep emerging in our day within social democracy, which is still far from a triumph that it may never attain, prove how extraordinarily hard it is to achieve that unified and universal moral and intellectual world to which so many people aspire. Even granting that such a world could be realized, it does not seem to us a desirable sort of world. So far in history, freedom to think, to observe, to judge men and things serenely and dispassionately, has been possible, always be it understood, for a few individuals, only in those societies in which numbers of different religious and political currents have been struggling for dominion. That same condition, as we have already seen, Chapter 5, Section 9, is almost indispensable for the attainment of what is commonly called political liberty, in other words, the highest possible degree of justice in the relations between governors and governed that is compatible with our imperfect human nature. In fact, in societies where choice among a number of religious and political currents has ceased to be possible because one such current has succeeded in gaining exclusive control, the isolated and original thinker has to be silent, and moral and intellectual monopoly is infallibly associated with political monopoly, to the advantage of a caste or of a very few social forces. The modern Masonic doctrine in Europe is based on the belief that man tends to become physically, intellectually and morally saner and nobler, and that only ignorance and superstition, which have generated the dogmatic religions, have prevented him from following that road, which is his natural road, and driven him to persecutions, massacres and fratricidal strife. Such a view does not seem to us tenable. The revealed religions, which many people are now calling superstitions, were not taught to man by an extra-human being. They were created by men themselves, and they have always found their nourishment and their raison d'etre in human nature. They are only in part, and sometimes in very small part, responsible for struggles, massacres and persecutions. These are due more often to the passions of men than to the dogmas that religions teach. In fact, in the light of impartial history, the excuse of the times, and of religious and political fanaticism, takes away only a small fraction of individual responsibility for outrages of every sort. Whatever the times may be, in every religion, in every doctrine, each of us can find and does find the tendency that best suits his character and temperament. Mohammedanism did not prevent Saladin from being a humane and generous soul even in dealing with infidels, any more than Christianity mitigated the ferocity of Richard the Lion-Hearted. That king, so celebrated for his chivalry, was responsible for the massacre of 3,000 Mohammedan prisoners, taken after the strenuous defense at Acre, and it was due to the generosity of Saladin that terrible example was not followed on a large scale by the Mohammedan army. The same religion that gave the world Simon de Montfort and Torquemada also gave the world St. Francis of Assisi and St. Teresa. The year 1793 saw the lives and feats of Marat, Robespierre and Carrier, the Conventionist Carrier, who had the children of the Vendeans drowned by the thousand at Nantes. But that same year knew Bonchamps, the leader of the Loyalists in the Vendée, who, as he lay wounded on his deathbed, pleaded for the lives of 4,000 Republican prisoners whom his fellow soldiers were intending to shoot down, and won their release. As a matter of fact, in the course of the past century the bitterest struggles have been fought, the worst persecutions and massacres have been perpetrated, in the name of doctrines which have no basis at all in the supernatural, and which proclaim the liberty, equality and fraternity of all men. The feeling that springs spontaneously from an unprejudiced judgment of the history of humanity is compassion for the contradictory qualities of this poor human race of ours, so rich in abnegation, so ready at times for personal sacrifice, yet whose every attempt, whether more or less successful or not at all successful, to attain moral and material betterment, is coupled with an unleashing of hates, rancors and the basest passions. A tragic destiny is that of men. Aspiring ever to pursue and achieve what they think is the good, they ever find pretexts for slaughtering and persecuting each other. Once they slaughtered and persecuted over the interpretation of a dogma, or of a passage in the Bible. Then they slaughtered and persecuted in order to inaugurate the kingdom of liberty, equality and fraternity. Today they are slaughtering and persecuting and fiendishly torturing each other in the name of other creeds. Perhaps tomorrow they will slaughter and torment each other in an effort to banish the last trace of violence and injustice from the earth.